It is the early morning hours of January 31, 1968, and the humid air of Saigon is suddenly shattered by the deafening roar of 122-millimeter rockets slamming into the capital. Imagine being a United States Marine guarding the American Embassy, the ultimate symbol of Washington's power in Southeast Asia, only to find elite enemy sappers blowing a hole right through the outer wall. For years, the American public had been told the enemy was on the run, hiding in the jungles, bleeding out from relentless bombing campaigns. Yet, on this night, over 80,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong guerrillas simultaneously strike more than 100 cities, towns, and military bases across South Vietnam. This is not a random skirmish. This is a masterclass in strategic deception, a nationwide shockwave that would break the political will of the most powerful military machine on the planet. How does a superpower with absolute air supremacy, satellite intelligence, and 500,000 heavily armed troops lose the element of surprise to an army moving largely on foot? We are going to tear apart the mechanics of the Tet Offensive, dissecting the intelligence failures, the logistical miracles, and the brutal tactical realities that changed the course of history. If you want to understand the grim realities of modern warfare and the hard lessons written in blood, you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let us dive into the meat grinder of Vietnam. To understand how the American military intelligence apparatus was caught completely flat-footed in 1968, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic foundation of the conflict. The roots of this disaster were planted decades earlier, long before the first American combat boots hit the beaches of Da Nang in 1965. Following the end of World War II, the French attempted to reclaim their colonial empire in Indochina, only to be systematically dismantled by General Vo Nguyen Giap at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. That battle should have been a glaring warning light on the dashboard of Western military planners. Giap proved that a technologically inferior force could achieve victory through sheer logistical willpower, dragging heavy artillery up impossible jungle mountains to crush a fortified Western garrison. But Washington, gripped by the Cold War paranoia of the domino theory, believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow like a row of falling dominoes. By the time General William Westmoreland took command of the Military Assistance, Command Vietnam, or MACV, the American strategy was built on a deeply flawed premise. Westmoreland believed this was a war of attrition. The logic was heavily influenced by the whiz kids at the Pentagon, led by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who treated war like a corporate balance sheet. They relied on a metric called the crossover point. The theory was simple. If American forces could kill the enemy faster than North Vietnam could replace them, the enemy would eventually break and sue for peace. How do you measure progress in a war without front lines? You count the bodies. This obsession with body counts led to the deployment of massive search and destroy operations like Operation Cedar Falls and Operation Junction City in 1967. American mechanized infantry and airmobile divisions would sweep through areas like the Iron Triangle, burning villages, bulldozing bunkers, and calling in massive artillery strikes. By late 1967, the MACV command was producing charts and graphs showing that the Viet Cong were decimated. Westmoreland even went on a public relations tour in the United States, standing before Congress and the National Press Club in November 1967, famously declaring that the enemies were bankrupt and that there was light at the end of the tunnel. This was a fatal miscalculation of the enemy's strategic doctrine. The North Vietnamese did not fight a war of attrition based on casualty ratios. They fought according to the doctrine of Dao Tran, a two-pronged strategy of armed struggle and political struggle. To Hanoi, losing 10 men for every 1 American was an acceptable exchange rate, as long as the political will of the American public was being eroded. This brings to mind the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Just like in the winter of 1944, when Allied intelligence was absolutely convinced that the German army was a spent force incapable of launching a major offensive. MACV, in 1967, believed the Viet Cong were relegated to minor harassment actions. In both cases, technological superiority bred a dangerous arrogance. The Pentagon's supercomputers could calculate the fuel consumption of a B-52 bomber down to the last drop, but they could not quantify the human willingness to die for a unified Vietnam. In the months leading up to the Tet Offensive, General Giap and the North Vietnamese Politburo orchestrated one of the most brilliant strategic diversions in military history. They began massing regular North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, divisions near the demilitarized zone, specifically targeting the isolated United States Marine Combat Base at Khe Sanh. Beginning on January 21, 1968, the NVA unleashed a massive artillery barrage on Khe Sanh, raining hundreds of shells onto the airstrip and entrenched Marine positions. President Lyndon B. Johnson was terrified of suffering an American Dien Bien Phu. He literally had a sand table model of Khe Sanh built in the White House basement, and made his Joint Chiefs of Staff sign a blood oath that the base would not fall. Westmoreland took the bait completely. He shifted half of all American combat battalions in South Vietnam to the northernmost provinces, committing massive amounts of air power and logistics to defend a patch of red dirt. Operation Niagara, the air campaign to defend Khe Sanh, dropped over 100,000 tons of bombs in a few square miles. While American eyes were locked on the northern border, the real threat was quietly infiltrating the urban centers of the South. Let us break down the massive disparity in the order of battle, because the sheer scale of the forces involved dictates the brutal nature of the urban combat that was about to unfold. By January 1968, the United States had over 492,000 troops in country, supported by another 61 ZUs and allied troops from nations like South Korea and Australia. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, boasted a paper strength of over 340,000 regulars, plus regional and popular forces. The American military machine in Vietnam was a logistical Leviathan, It consumed millions of gallons of aviation fuel and thousands of tons of ammunition every single day. The backbone of American mobility was the helicopter, specifically the UH-1 Iroquois, universally known as the Huey. The Huey allowed American commanders to leapfrog over impenetrable jungle, dropping heavily armed infantry squads directly into combat zones. An airmobile division, like the 1st Cavalry Division, could deploy over 400 helicopters, giving them a rapid reaction capability unmatched in human history. On the ground, American armored cavalry units relied on the M48A3 Patton tank. Weighing in at 47 tons and armed with a 90mm main gun, the M48 was a beast in conventional warfare. Its cast steel armor was highly effective against small arms and shrapnel. However, in the dense, narrow streets of cities like Hue and Saigon, these tanks would soon find themselves severely restricted, their side and rear armor vulnerable to close-range anti-tank ambushes. The standard-issue weapon for the American infantryman was the M66A1 rifle, firing a high-velocity 56mm round. The M16 was lightweight and allowed soldiers to carry more ammunition. But the early versions of the M16 deployed to Vietnam were plagued by catastrophic jamming issues. The lack of chrome-lined barrels, combined with a change in the gunpowder formulation by the Ordnance Department, meant that carbon buildup caused the rifles to seize up in the humid, muddy environment. Troops were literally dying while trying to push cleaning rods down the barrels of their jammed rifles. Above the battlefield, the United States commanded undisputed control of the skies. F-4 Phantom fighter bombers provided close air support, delivering napalm, unguided rockets, and heavy ordnance with devastating accuracy. The ultimate hammer was the B-52 Stratofortress. Flying from bases in Guam and Thailand, a single B-52 could carry up to 70,000 pounds of conventional bombs. A 3-ship formation of B-52s executing an arc light strike could obliterate an area 1 mile long and half a mile wide, turning triple canopy jungle into a moonscape in seconds. American tactical doctrine relied heavily on this overwhelming firepower. If an infantry platoon made contact with the enemy, the standard operating procedure was to pull back, establish a perimeter, and call in artillery and air support to annihilate the grid square. It was a doctrine built on the assumption that firepower solves all tactical problems. But what happens when the enemy grabs you by the belt buckle? What happens when the enemy infiltrates a heavily populated city where dropping a 500-pound bomb means leveling a historic hospital or a school? The North Vietnamese understood exactly how to neutralize American fire superiority. The forces opposing the Americans were a complex hybrid of regular army units and guerrilla fighters. The People's Army of Vietnam, commonly referred to as the NVA, consisted of highly disciplined, conventional infantry divisions equipped by the Soviet Union and Communist China. They wore uniforms, carried standardized weapons, and were trained in complex, multi-battalion maneuvers. Operating alongside them were the People's Liberation Armed Forces, known to the Americans as the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were divided into two tiers. You had the main force VC battalions, which were essentially regular light infantry, heavily armed and highly mobile. Then you had the local guerrillas, the farmers by day, and fighters by night, who provided intelligence, laid booby traps, and maintained the logistical networks. For the Tet Offensive, the Communists committed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 troops to the initial assault waves. Their primary infantry weapon was the legendary AK-47 assault rifle, chambered in the heavier 7.62 by 39 mm cartridge. The AK-47 was a masterpiece of rugged simplicity. Its loose tolerances meant it could be dropped in the mud, dragged through a swamp, and still fire reliably. For anti-armor and bunker-busting operations, the Communist forces relied on the RPG-2 and the newer, deadlier RPG-7. The RPG-7 fired a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating over 10 inches of steel armor. In the urban combat that was about to unfold, the RPG would become the ultimate equalizer against American armor, fired from rooftops and sewer grates at point-blank range. The Communist indirect fire support came from highly mobile 82 mm mortars and 122 mm unguided rockets. These rockets could be launched from crude, dirt mound ramps, requiring no heavy artillery pieces to transport. A VC rocket team could set up a launch site, fire a barrage into an American airbase, and melt back into the jungle before counter-battery radar could even track their trajectory. The true miracle of the Communist war machine, however, was its logistical network, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was not a single paved road, but a complex 10,000-mile labyrinth of dirt tracks, hidden bypasses, and underground depots carving through the neutral territories of Laos and Cambodia. While the Americans relied on massive cargo planes and convoys of heavy trucks, the North Vietnamese moved mountains of supplies on the backs of human porters. A single peasant pushing a heavily modified bicycle could transport up to 400 pounds of rice, ammunition, and medical supplies down the trail. It was a slow, agonizing process, but it was virtually immune to the high-tech American bombing campaigns. You cannot interdict a bicycle with a B-52. To prepare for the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong spent months smuggling weapons and ammunition directly into the heart of South Vietnam's major cities. They exploited the bustling civilian traffic, hiding AK-47s under loads of cabbages in ox carts, packing RPG warheads into false-bottomed sampans floating down the Mekong River, and even staging fake funerals to smuggle heavy machine guns inside wooden coffins. Local VC cadres mapped out every police station, every radio tower, and every military compound in cities like Saigon, Hue, and Da Nang. They rented safe houses, memorized guard shift changes, and stockpiled civilian clothing to blend in perfectly with the population. The timing of the offensive was a stroke of psychological genius. Tet Nguyen Dan, the Lunar New Year, is the most sacred holiday in Vietnamese culture. Historically, both sides had observed an unofficial ceasefire during the Tet festivities. In late January 1968, thousands of ARVN soldiers were granted leave to return to their home villages to celebrate with their families. The cities were flooded with millions of civilians. Firecrackers were popping in the streets, and the atmosphere was relaxed. It is impossible not to draw a parallel to George Washington's daring crossing of the Delaware River in 1776, striking the Hessian garrison at Trenton the morning after Christmas. When you attack an enemy during their most sacred holiday, you exploit a fundamental psychological vulnerability. You catch them with their boots off, their weapons racked, and their minds focused on home. The MAC-CV intelligence apparatus had picked up scattered signs of a build-up. Captured documents spoke of a general offensive and general uprising, a massive campaign designed to spark a nationwide civilian revolt against the South Vietnamese government. But American intelligence analysts suffered from severe confirmation bias. They read the reports, looked at the captured orders, and dismissed them as communist propaganda. They simply could not fathom that an enemy they believed to be starving and depleted could coordinate a simultaneous strike across an entire country. Lieutenant General Frederick Weyand, commander of the Sioux Field Force protecting the capital region, was one of the few who sensed something was terribly wrong. Noticing a drop in radio traffic and an eerie silence in the countryside, Weyand convinced Westmoreland to pull a few American combat battalions closer to Saigon just days before the attack. That localized tactical adjustment would end up saving the capital from complete annihilation, but it was a mere band-aid on a gaping strategic wound. As the sun sets on January 30th, the streets of Saigon are packed with revelers preparing for the midnight celebrations. In the dark alleys, in the basements of tea houses, and in the dense palm groves just outside the city limits, tens of thousands of communist fighters are unearthing their buried weapons. They are loading their magazines, checking the fuses on their satchel charges, and tying red ribbons around their arms to identify friend from foe in the coming chaos. The greatest intelligence failure of the Vietnam War has already occurred, and the American military is completely blind to the storm that is about to hit. The stage is set, the pieces are in place, and as the fireworks of the Lunar New Year begin to explode over Saigon, the real detonations are about to shatter the illusion of control. At exactly 2:45 in the morning, the illusion of a secure capital is shattered by the blast of a 15-pound satchel charge of C4 explosive. A massive hole is ripped through the concrete perimeter wall of the United States Embassy compound in Saigon. Through the dust and smoke, 19 elite commandos of the Viet Cong C-10 Sapper battalion pour into the courtyard, armed with AK-47 assault rifles, RPG-2 rocket launchers, and pockets full of fragmentation grenades. These men had driven up to the heavily fortified gates in a seemingly innocent Peugeot taxicab and a small delivery truck. Now they are inside the most heavily defended diplomatic compound in the world. The immediate American response falls to a handful of military police from the 716th MP Battalion. This is a textbook demonstration of the brutal, chaotic nature of close-quarters combat. The MPs are armed primarily with 12-gauge pump-action shotguns, M16 rifles, and the legendary M191-11A1. .45 caliber sidearm. The M19111 pistol, a heavy piece of American ordnance, designed decades earlier to stop charging combatants in the Philippines, proves its worth in the fatal funnels of the embassy courtyard. When a Viet Cong sapper rounds a corner with an AK-47, the massive stopping power of a 230-grain, .45 caliber slug is absolute. The initial blast kills the first two sappers through the wall, but the remaining fighters scatter across the manicured lawn, firing rockets at the thick mahogany doors of the main Chancery building. How does a squad of 19 lightly armed insurgents completely paralyze the nerve center of American military and political power in Asia? They do it through sheer audacity and the psychological shock of the unthinkable. For 6 agonizing hours, a fierce firefight rages on the embassy grounds. American commanders are forced to land elements of the 101st Airborne Division onto the roof via Huey helicopters, sweeping the building floor by floor. By 9 in the morning, the embassy is secured, and all 19 sappers are dead or captured. Tactically, it is a complete failure for the Viet Cong, as they never breached the main building or captured the ambassador. But strategically, the damage is already done. News cameras are rolling, capturing the blood-stained concrete and the bodies of enemy fighters sprawled on pristine American lawn. If the enemy can breach the American embassy, nowhere is safe. Simultaneously, the entire city of Saigon erupts into a war zone. Viet Cong main force battalions assault the massive Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the presidential palace, and the national radio station. In the densely populated, labyrinthine streets of the Cholon district, the Viet Cong turns civilian infrastructure into a fortress. American and South Vietnamese forces deploy the M113 armored personnel carrier to navigate the urban sprawl. The M113 is a tracked, aluminum armored box originally designed to ferry infantry across open battlefields in Europe. In the narrow alleys of Saigon, its aluminum skin is highly vulnerable to the shaped charges of enemy RPGs and concentrated heavy machine gun fire. However, the M103 mounts the devastating M2 Browning .50 caliber heavy machine gun. Firing a massive half-inch diameter bullet at over 2,000 feet per second, the Deuce can punch right through brick walls, concrete pillars, and the engine blocks of civilian vehicles used as barricades. The fighting in Saigon is a series of sharp, violent, mechanized sweeps, but it is entirely different from the nightmare, unfolding 400 miles to the north. While Saigon is a series of commando raids and street skirmishes, the city of Hue becomes the site of the longest, bloodiest conventional battle of the Tet Offensive. Hue is the ancient imperial capital of Vietnam, geographically split by the wide, sluggish waters of the Perfume River. On the north bank sits the citadel, a massive 3-square-mile fortress enclosed by stone walls 30 feet high and up to 30 feet thick, surrounded by a zigzagging moat. Under the cover of the dense, foggy monsoon weather, over 8,000 troops of the North Vietnamese Army, including the elite 6th NVA Regiment, march into the city virtually undetected. They swiftly overrun the local government buildings. execute thousands of civilians deemed loyal to the South Vietnamese government, and raise the massive gold-starred flag of the Viet Cong over the citadel's highest tower. The American response is initially hampered by a catastrophic intelligence failure. MACV headquarters in Saigon simply refuses to believe that an entire NVA division has occupied the city. They dispatch a single company of United States Marines from the 1st Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment to clear the city, driving them straight into a deadly multi-battalion ambush. The Marines are forced to adapt instantly to a form of warfare they had not seen since the Battle of Seoul in 1950, or the brutal street-to-street fighting in the Battle of Aachen during World War II. This is not a jungle patrol. This is a three-dimensional meat grinder. To make matters worse, the northeast monsoon has rolled in, dropping temperatures into the low 50s Fahrenheit and blanketing the city in a freezing, impenetrable mist. The cloud ceiling is sitting at less than 500 feet. What happens to an American military doctrine built entirely on overwhelming air support when the sky is completely shut down by Mother Nature? The B-52s are useless. The F-4 Phantoms cannot drop napalm without frying friendly troops. The artillery is heavily restricted to avoid destroying the historic imperial monuments. The Marines are stripped of their greatest advantage and forced to fight the NVA on equal terms, yard by bloody yard. The North Vietnamese employ a brilliant and ruthless urban defense doctrine. They use a tactic called hugging the belt, deliberately positioning their forces within 50 yards of American lines. By staying this close, they ensure that any American artillery or mortar strike will result in catastrophic friendly fire. The NVA turn every masonry home into a bunker, knocking firing ports through the brickwork just inches above the floor to shoot at the legs of advancing Marines. They employ mouse-holing, a technique where they blow holes through the interior walls of adjoining row houses. This allows NVA squads to move rapidly down an entire city block without ever stepping into the street, popping up behind American units to deliver devastating flanking fire. To counter this, the Marines of the 1st and 5th Regiments have to write a new tactical manual in real time. They rely heavily on the M50 Ontos, one of the most bizarre and terrifying armored vehicles ever fielded by the United States military. The Ontos is a small, lightly armored, tracked vehicle mounting 606 mm recoilless rifles on its turret. In the dense jungles, the Ontos was considered highly vulnerable due to its thin armor. But in the narrow, rubble-strewn streets of Hue, it is an absolute game-changer. A Marine squad pinned down by a sniper in a second-story window will call up an Ontos. The vehicle will roll up, sight the target using its .50 caliber spotting rifles, and unleash a volley of high-explosive plastic squash head rounds. These rounds flatten against the masonry before detonating, transmitting a massive shockwave that literally vaporizes the brick wall and anyone standing behind it. Alternatively, the Ontos can fire beehive rounds, artillery shells packed with 10,000 razor-sharp steel flechettes, turning a city street into a horizontal blender. The infantrymen also rely on the M72 Law, a lightweight, shoulder-fired, 66mm anti-tank rocket. Because the NVA do not have tanks in Hue, the Marines use the law as a master key. When a squad needs to cross an open courtyard swept by enemy machine guns, they fire a law into the side of the adjacent building, blowing a hole just large enough for a man to dive through. They clear rooms using CS tear gas grenades, tossing them into basements and bunkers to flush out the suffocating NVA defenders before hosing the exits with M16 fire. The fighting inside the citadel is a horrific war of attrition. The massive stone walls absorb 8-inch naval gunfire from American cruisers sitting offshore, barely leaving a dent. The ARVN Black Panther Company, an elite South Vietnamese Ranger unit, fights alongside the Marines, taking horrific casualties as they assault the Dong Ba Tower, a heavily fortified gatehouse that commands the eastern wall. Logistics become a nightmare. With the roads cut off and the weather grounding the supply helicopters, the only way to bring ammunition to the Marines and evacuate the shattered wounded is via the Perfume River. Navy landing craft utility boats, or LCUs, run a terrifying gauntlet. These slow-moving, flat-bottomed boats have to sail right past NVA positions on the riverbanks, absorbing RPG hits and mortar barrages to deliver desperately needed medical supplies. Can you imagine the psychological toll of fighting for 3 weeks to capture a single city block, watching your platoon get decimated, only to realize the enemy is just waiting in the next pile of rubble? By late February, the combined American and South Vietnamese forces finally break the back of the NVA defense in Hue. The Communist forces, having suffered thousands of casualties, quietly melt away into the western mountains, leaving behind a city reduced to smoking gravel. On the ground, the Tet Offensive is an unmitigated military disaster for the North Vietnamese. They have lost an estimated 40 to 50,000 fighters. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the south is effectively annihilated, and the general civilian uprising they promised never materialized. The American military machine has absorbed the ultimate sucker punch, stabilized the line, and absolutely crushed the enemy in open combat. But warfare in the television age is not decided solely by body counts or captured territory. While the Marines are sweeping the final pockets of resistance in Hue, the raw, unfiltered footage of the carnage is being beamed directly into millions of American living rooms every single evening. The sheer brutality of the urban combat, the sight of dead Americans draped over the hulls of tanks, and the undeniable reality that the enemy is capable of a massive, coordinated strike completely shatters the narrative of impending victory. A profound cognitive dissonance takes hold of the American public, a fatal gap between the optimistic statistics pushed by the Pentagon and the bloody reality broadcast on the nightly news. And as the smoke clears over the ruins of Hue, the most trusted man in America is preparing to look directly into the camera and deliver a verdict that will strike Washington harder than any enemy artillery barrage. On February 27, 1968, Walter Cronkite, the anchor of the CBS Evening News, looks directly into the camera lens and utters the words that will effectively end the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. Having just returned from the smouldering ruins of Hue and the blood-stained streets of Saigon, Cronkite, a man known as the most trusted man in America, breaks from his usual objective reporting to deliver a grim editorial. He states that it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy, and did the best they could. When President Johnson hears this broadcast, he reportedly turns to his aides and says, "If I have lost Cronkite, I have lost Middle America." This is the exact moment the strategic center of gravity in the Vietnam War shifts permanently. To understand the magnitude of this defeat, we must analyze the profound difference between a tactical victory and a strategic triumph, a concept that the Pentagon entirely failed to grasp. On a purely military level, the Tet Offensive is a catastrophic, unmitigated disaster for the Communist forces. General William Westmoreland and his commanders are absolutely correct when they claim they have decimated the enemy. The Viet Cong, as an independent, effective fighting force, is essentially wiped off the map. Their shadow government is exposed, their elite sappers are dead, and their veteran cadres are buried in mass graves outside of Hue and Saigon. From 1968 onward, the war will be fought almost entirely by the regular North Vietnamese army, because the southern insurgency has been bled white. But how does a military machine win every single tactical engagement, annihilate the enemy's front-line fighting force, and still lose the war? The answer lies in a fatal misunderstanding of the enemy's core strategy, a strategy deeply rooted in the writings of the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. Clausewitz famously wrote that war is the continuation of politics by other means. The American military establishment in 1968 treated war as an engineering problem, a mathematical equation of body counts, bomb tonnages, and artillery shells expended. General Vo Nguyen Giap and the Politburo in Hanoi treated war as a psychological weapon aimed directly at the political willpower of the American voting public. They understood that the American center of gravity was not the heavily armored M48 Patton tank, nor the B-52 bomber, but the tolerance of the American middle class for an endless bloody stalemate. We can see a brilliant historical parallel to this in the American Revolutionary War, specifically the Southern Campaign of 1781. American General Nathanael Greene faced the highly disciplined, technologically superior British Army commanded by Lord Cornwallis. Greene lost almost every single major tactical battle he fought against the British, including the bloody clash at Guilford Courthouse. Yet, by continuously engaging the British, bleeding their supply lines, and refusing to surrender, Greene completely exhausted the political will of the British Parliament to continue funding the war, leading directly to the British collapse at Yorktown. Giap played the exact same strategic game against Washington, using the blood of his own soldiers to bankrupt the American political establishment. The intelligence failure that allowed the Tet Offensive to happen is another critical lesson in the limits of technological arrogance. The United States possessed the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering apparatus in human history. They had high-altitude reconnaissance planes taking crystal-clear photographs of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They had seismic sensors dropped into the jungle canopy to detect the movement of enemy trucks. They had the National Security Agency intercepting thousands of communist radio transmissions. Yet they were completely blind to the movement of 80,000 enemy troops into the major urban centers. This failure is eerily reminiscent of the intelligence disaster at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Before Pearl Harbor, American cryptographers had broken the Japanese diplomatic codes, and naval intelligence had intercepted massive amounts of data indicating an impending attack. But the analysts in Washington suffered from a crippling confirmation bias. They believed the Japanese were incapable of projecting power all the way to Hawaii, so they interpreted all the intercepted data as noise, assuming the attack would happen in the Philippines. Similarly, in 1967, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, had captured enemy documents explicitly detailing a general offensive and general uprising. But because Westmoreland's staff was absolutely convinced the enemy was on the verge of collapse, they dismissed these documents as desperate communist propaganda. They relied entirely on signals intelligence, listening to radio chatter, while ignoring human intelligence on the ground. The North Vietnamese knew the Americans were listening, so they maintained strict radio silence, moving their orders via human couriers traversing the jungle on foot. When you rely entirely on technology to understand your enemy, you lose the ability to understand their human intent. The logistical and economic realities of the Tet Offensive also expose the fatal flaws in the American way of war. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and his Pentagon whiz-kids tried to fight a cost-effective war, but the economics of Vietnam were completely asymmetrical. The United States was spending billions of dollars to maintain a massive logistical footprint. To keep a single American infantry battalion supplied in the field required a staggering tale of support personnel, mechanics, cooks, air traffic controllers, and supply kailarks. The American military was dropping million-dollar bombs from multi-million-dollar aircraft to destroy bamboo footbridges that cost the enemy absolutely nothing to rebuild. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese war machine was fueled by Soviet and Chinese subsidies, but powered by the sheer brutal endurance of the peasant class. The contrast in primary infantry weapons perfectly encapsulates this economic asymmetry. The American M16 rifle was a marvel of modern engineering, constructed from aircraft-grade aluminum and synthetic plastics. But it required specialized cleaning kits, highly refined gunpowder, and a complex industrial base to maintain. The communist AK-47 was stamped from cheap steel and fitted with crude wooden furniture. It was heavy, it was not particularly accurate at long ranges, but it was virtually indestructible and required zero logistical support to keep firing. In the grinding war of attrition that followed Tet, the cheap, durable weapon outperformed the expensive, high-maintenance weapon. Furthermore, the Tet Offensive shattered the American economy on the home front. President Johnson had attempted to fund his massive domestic social programs known as the Great Society. while simultaneously funding a massive overseas war without raising taxes. This guns and butter policy created a massive national deficit and sparked rampant inflation that would cripple the American economy for a decade. When Westmoreland requested an additional 206,000 troops in the immediate aftermath of Tet, the economic advisors in the White House finally rebelled. They informed the president that deploying that many men would require mobilizing the strategic reserves, implementing massive tax hikes, and putting the nation on a total war footing. The American public, having just watched the embassy get breached on television, was absolutely unwilling to pay that price. Tactically, the urban combat of Tet forced the American military to relearn lessons written in blood during World War II. Lessons that had been forgotten in the era of nuclear deterrence and helicopter assaults. The Battle of Hue proved that massive firepower cannot independently hold ground. You can level a city with naval gunfire and B-52 strikes, but ultimately, capturing and holding terrain requires a 19-year-old infantryman with a rifle to kick down a door and clear a room. And in an urban environment, the technological advantages of the superior force are severely degraded. Tanks become steel coffins when trapped in narrow streets, vulnerable to cheap anti-tank rockets fired from rooftops. Air support is neutralized by bad weather and the enemy's tactic of hugging the belt. The infantry is forced into a brutal face-to-face meat grinder, where the side willing to absorb the most casualties usually dictates the pace of the battle. This is the grim reality of modern urban warfare, a reality that would haunt American military planners from the streets of Mogadishu to the ruins of Fallujah decades later. In the aftermath of the offensive, the political fallout is absolute. On March 31, 1968, a broken and exhausted Lyndon B. Johnson addresses the nation on television. He announces a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam, calls for peace negotiations, and then drops a political bombshell. He declares that he will not seek and will not accept the nomination of his party for another term as your president. The commander-in-chief of the most powerful military on earth has been politically assassinated by an army of guerrillas and light infantrymen. The Tet Offensive remains the ultimate cautionary tale for any modern superpower. It proves that you can win every battle. It control the skies, rule the seas, and still lose the war if you do not understand the political will of your own people. Military might without a clear, achievable political objective is nothing but an exercise in organized slaughter. The ghosts of Hue and Saigon still whisper a harsh truth to those willing to listen, reminding us that in the brutal arithmetic of war, the human spirit will always outlast the machine. If you want to survive the battlefield of history, you must understand that the deadliest weapon an enemy possesses is not a rifle or a rocket, but the willingness to die for a cause, while your own people lose the will to fight. What do you think was the single biggest factor that broke the American political will during the Tet Offensive? A. The raw, uncensored television coverage, bringing the brutality of urban combat into American living rooms. B. The massive intelligence failure that shattered the public's trust in the military leadership. C. The sheer economic and logistical cost of fighting an endless war against a highly motivated insurgency. Let me know your choice in the comments below, and stay sharp.